In 1936, the Soviet constitution guaranteed women full legal equality with men, the right to work, to education, to vote, and even hold high-level leadership positions. By the 1970s, around 90% of working-age women were either employed or studying, which is a figure no Western country came close to at the time. Others, like Switzerland, hadn't even granted women the right to vote yet. On those numbers alone, the Soviet Union had the most dramatic women's emancipation project in modern history. And animation actually played a big part in that, in educating the population by creating the models and the archetypes for the so-called Homo Sovieticus. The Soviet state had a word for what animations were supposed to do, воспитание, roughly translated as the shaping of character from childhood. Союзмультфильм, the single-state animation studio created in 1936 by merging all independent studios into one, produced over 1,500 films. Every one of them passed through state approval, and every one of them was, in some sense, a lesson. And lessons don't have to be spoken out loud to land. When a child watches the same kinds of women in the same kinds of roles hundreds and hundreds of times, those images are then perceived as normal or even obvious. What I found to be a particularly striking portrayal of the so-called perfect Soviet woman appears in the animation The Companion of the Queen, dated 1962. In this animation, a young agricultural worker named Galia seems to embody everything the regime idealized. She flies a helicopter, drives a tractor, manages an entire harvest district, and even steps in to rescue her lazy neighbor's failing field. The narrator grandly introduces her as the mistress of the earth and sky, reinforcing her almost superhuman competence. These early archetypes were not at all accidental, because here is what history looks like up close. The emancipation of Soviet women was not initiated because the state cared about the women. It was initiated because 2 world wars had killed so many men that there weren't enough workers to rebuild the economy. Women weren't liberated, they were mobilized. Around the same time, in 1963, an American writer named Betty Friedan described something she called the problem with no name. She was writing about educated Western women living in comfortable suburban homes who had apparently won everything a woman was supposed to want and were slowly going out of their minds. Not visibly or dramatically, just living the quiet sense of disappearing inside a life built entirely around other people's needs. Domesticity as a form of slow erasure. The Soviet response to this, had there been one, would probably have been, obviously, women need to work to contribute to have a life outside the home. The Soviets weren't entirely wrong. Work matters, and economic independence matters. And although the Western housewife model was its own kind of trap, none of the 2 models specifically actually center women's interests or create any real balance so that women are free, happy, and accomplished for their own sake, instead of catering to someone else's needs, be it their family, workplace, or an entire society. By the 1980s, Soviet animation was full of the same image. The woman, the mother, the wife who works full-time, then comes home, cooks, cleans, raises the children, supports her husband, and somewhere in between manages to do something phenomenal. If any frustration is ever expressed, it is treated as a comedic moment. This was not a coincidence. Soviet animation was not merely entertainment meant for children. It was a state-funded, ideological instrument purposefully built to shape how citizens from the youngest age understood family, gender, and their place in society. What it chose to show women doing, decade after decade, is a document of what the state actually needed from them. And what it needed was everything, doubled. In Family Marathon, made in 1981 by Ukrainian animator Volodymyr Dakhno, the husband is preparing for a race. We see him very relaxed before the race, while the wife prepares him and takes care of several other chores, like ironing, preparing his clothes, massaging him, and taking care of the children. When the race starts, the camera cuts between him running a single track and her running a parallel one. We see her engaging in multiple activities. She is cooking, cleaning, running chores, and periodically going back to the track to help her husband. Gets back to the finish line just in time to cross it first, and nobody notices. When her husband wins a medal, the weight of it makes him collapse, so she carries him home on her back. The film is funny. It's clearly funny, exaggerated, and absurdist, but it's making an argument so precise that it barely needs commentary. Every success this man achieves rests on invisible labor that is never credited, never counted, or even seen. 6 years later, in 1987, Elena Prorocova did something even more eerie in a film called 9 to 6. She put the viewer inside the woman's body. The entire film is first person. You wake up as her. You rush her family out the door. You leave for work having only had time to make up one eye. You spend the day at your architectural drafting table, intercutting with the mental list running constantly underneath. What to cook, when to do laundry, whether the child called. On the bus home, after the grocery store, after the laundry, you finally do the second eye. And this face, both your own and not belonging to you, dissolves into dozens of other women's faces. The year before, Prorocova made a film called A Fairy Tale About a Stupid Husband. And in the credits, it says it's inspired by a story about a stupid wife. I tried to read it and I honestly couldn't get through it. The woman is constantly portrayed as a fool, even though all she's doing is trying to be kind and caring to her deceased husband and to her current one, who married her for her inheritance and clearly resents her. And that money is never really hers. It belongs to the dead husband or to the current one. The moment she makes a decision about it, she gets insulted or beaten. So when Prorocova takes something like that and turns it into a story about a stupid husband, I don't think that's a neutral adaptation. I don't think she just got inspired. I can imagine her reading something like that, or even just the title, and having no safe way to respond directly. So she flipped it. She turned the structure around, pushed it in the other direction, made it visible. It's not a perfect solution. Just reversing sexism doesn't undo it. But if direct criticism isn't possible, then this becomes something else. She's not just depicting women's exhaustion, she's pointing at where it comes from. If you're wondering how could these films get made at all, the Soviet cultural apparatus didn't relax overnight. It loosened gradually, first under Khrushchev in the 60s, then again under Brezhnev's relative stability, and more significantly under Gorbachev's glasnost from 1985 onward. Each of these periods left animators slightly more room to experiment. Satire specifically was often tolerated because the authorities read it as harmless comedy rather than political critique. If you wrapped your argument in enough absurdism, enough humor, enough visual exaggeration, it could get through. So artists like Prorocova pushed what the format could hold. Now going back to Friedan's housewife for a moment. Western feminism of the 1960s and 70s was largely built on the fight to get out of the home and into the workforce, to be economically independent and to have a professional identity. These were real stakes and real wins. While Soviet women had technically been there since the 1930s, the image didn't correspond to the feminist dream. They were exhausted, invisible, and catering to everyone else's needs. Which means the problem was never really about whether women could work. Both systems extracted women's labor, but neither redistributed the domestic burden fairly or sufficiently. neither even asked what she actually wanted. The animations made in the final decade of the Soviet Union were not, in the end, about the Soviet Union. They were about a structure so old and so persistent that it survived the revolution that was supposed to abolish it, and the feminist wave that was supposed to dismantle it. While Friedan wrote about women disappearing inside the home, simply entering the workforce was never a solution. Because the home doesn't disappear, it remains, along with the responsibilities that were never redistributed. Without addressing this double shift, women are still being asked to disappear, only now across multiple spaces. Thank you for watching. I started this endeavor to put my degrees in film and culture to work. There's so much more I would love to dive into, so please subscribe so I have a reason to keep doing this instead of getting a real job.